Welcome to CivilNet. Our guest today is Dr. Harry Hagopian, who is, as many diasporans, still a resident of the Middle East, often in Europe, frequently in the various countries of the Middle East, consulting for various church organizations. In his former life, he was with the Middle East Council of Churches, which is not just a religious organization. On the contrary, it's really an organization that takes the church's calling to meet social and political issues in areas where the church's constituency, Christians, reside. Dr. Hagopian is an attorney, and he has most recently been all over North Africa and the Middle East. And we'd like to talk to him specifically today about his impressions, his conclusions of the situation of not just Armenians in specifically Syria and Egypt, but Christian minority generally. And we're talking about Syria and Egypt because Syria, as everyone knows, is on the brink of something and no one quite knows what. And Egypt just concluded elections that left many, at the very least, frustrated and not knowing what to expect next. In that context, Dr. Harry Hagopian, thank you for talking with us. Let's please start with your most recent experiences in Syria and Egypt. Perhaps we should start with Egypt. You were there immediately prior to the elections, is that right?
Yep.
And
it is a pleasure to be sharing this short conversation with you. What is happening is quite worrying. It is worrying because there is so much uncertainty, there is so much confusion, and there is so much fear as to what the future holds for all Egyptians. And now, what unfortunately has happened and what experience has taught us, and I have certainly seen this across the whole vast region, is that those ideas of fresh transfer of power, the right of citizenship, fundamental freedoms, has stumbled. And the reason it has stumbled is that it's being co-opted by different powers and authorities here and there. For instance, you talked about Egypt. We started in Egypt at Tahrir Square with young men and women, what was known at the time as the Twitter generation, who were basically demonstrating against President Hosni Mubarak and his regime. And then gradually, as things moved forward, suddenly we saw that the big boys, whether the military council in Egypt, which has since 1954, since the days of President Gamal Abdel Nasser, has had a big say in the country, gradually begin to creep back and take over control of the country on the one side, and the Muslim Brotherhood, who thought this is their chance to entrench themselves in society, trying also to take over.
Isn't it natural that a group that wages a revolution of sorts requires a different kind of organizational capacity than it takes to run a political campaign, and that's a different organizational capacity than it takes to govern? So does this simply mean that the same revolutionaries are now going to have to regroup and reorganize in order to become a functional political force in a political system and not outside the political system?
You're absolutely right, Salpi. One of the problems, and I've said this from the beginning, is that there was this impetus for a revolution, a spring, an uprising, a protest, call it what you will. But what happened is suddenly those people realized that going out in the streets and protesting against the regime is one thing. Even moving presidents, whether in Tunisia, in Egypt, and certainly in Libya, is another thing. However, to have the modalities of governance, to know what to do with the power that they are claiming, that is something else. And this is part of where the breach began to appear. And at the moment, what is happening is because there was that gap, because there was that breach, the more organized, the more powerful movements in Egypt, for instance, since you raised the issue
sure,
of the
that's
issue
natural. But are they organizing? Are the revolutionaries now out of the game, or are they going to come back in?
No, I think they're going to come back in. They're not out of the game. They're certainly there. If you look at Tahrir Square today, you will find masses and masses of those young people who are being re-energized, who are basically going back again into the revolutionary spirit in order to try and reclaim what they have already got and prevent it from being lost.
What happens to the Armenians in all this?
The Armenians are part and parcel, I believe, of the whole society in the whole region. One thing I disagree with, and I've often said this, whether it's about Christian communities across the board or Armenians which are part of that community, they are certainly in Egypt and certainly in Syria, is that they're part of that sense of citizenship, that population. So what happens to everybody happens to them. They're not an exception. They should be part and parcel of the experiences that that region is going through at the moment.
Do they agree with you? Is that what they're doing? Are they part and parcel of this political change?
Well, this is the interesting thing. If you look at the headlines in different newspapers on, or you listen to some people talking about the Christian communities across the region, whether, for instance, in Syria or elsewhere, there are two trends of thought. One says that the Christian communities are afraid of change, that they are probably favorable to having the status quo established and running, because at least that way they have certain fundamental freedoms, such as that of worship, which they can continue with. Whereas if they open themselves up to all those uprisings, then some of them fear that if we have a more Islamic or worse Islamist nature of governance, then those freedoms would disappear overnight and they would be in a far worse shape. Now, this is one headline, one school of thought that is very much prevalent in the region and certainly in Syria. However, there is another counter school of thought which is not getting enough oxygen in the international media, where a lot of people, take somebody like Michel Kilo, take somebody like Father Paulo, take others who are saying, no, this is not right. The essence of Christianity is peace, justice, and reconciliation, and we cannot basically close our eyes and say, for the sake of our own personal parochial interests, we are going to forget anything bad that is happening in the country. So if you ask me, as many people have done, what is the status of Christians in Syria and across the board, I'll tell you a small rump of them support the regime of President Bashar al-Assad. Some of them, a small rump again, support the protests that are happening across the whole of Syria. But the large chunk are fearful, are afraid, are a bit confused and perplexed about what the future holds for them. That is the rump that needs to make its mind up, and at the moment it hasn't yet.
Is it fair to say that that rump, whether Armenian, Christian, Arab, is the middle class that's neither too poor to not react and not part of the elite that benefits from the system? Is there an economic overlap here?
There was very much an economic overlap at the beginning. If you take again the case of Syria, which is much more conspicuous than in other countries such as Libya, Tunisia, Yemen, and even Egypt, there was a very, very interesting observation made by many pundits that if you looked at Syria and at the uprisings, you would see that Damascus and Aleppo were the ones that were spared those uprisings. Why Damascus? Because it's the political capital. Why Aleppo? Because it's the business capital. And where the rich merchants, whether Sunni, Christian, or others, existed. However, even those constants have become variables now, where we see a lot of riots and a lot of protests in Damascus and in Aleppo, which to me means one thing. On the one hand, that the range of those protests is expanding, that the central authority is weakening, but that also we are reaching a peak where something has to give. And at the moment, nothing is giving, because on the side of the regime, things are pretty much still on the up and up. On the side of the protests, they are still maintaining their uprising without really managing any considerable gains, yet certainly not with the international community, which has its own calculations. And so we are basically at a stalemate, and that stalemate has to be broken, which is what Kofi Annan tried, but in my opinion, wrongly so, in order to be able to save Syria and also salvage the whole region.
And one last question. The Armenian communities, specifically of Syria and Egypt, are they coordinated, organized, or are the Armenian community responses really the responses of those who are the most visible, perhaps the richest, perhaps the most connected? Is there a strategy, as there was in Lebanon, for example, all those years?
I think there is a strategy. It is not a very clear and defined strategy, Salpi, but it is one that I'm very, very happy to say is happening in Syria. All the Christian communities, whether Orthodox in their majority or Catholic and evangelical Armenians, have come together and they are working together as one unit. Now, what that means is that, first of all, they're taking care of each other's interests, which is always helpful, but at the same time, they are not saying much. They're not on the airwaves, they're not being too visible, but at the same time, they are more or less keeping a low profile in a way that would neither exacerbate their situation with the protests themselves or at the same time exacerbate their position with the regime. So my feedback from different sources within Syria itself, including Armenians, including the Hamaskain Center, including others who are in Aleppo and different parts of Syria, as well as the feedback I get from Lebanon, given the organic connection between those two countries, is that the Armenian community is pretty much like any other community, fearful and a bit confused, but it is still maintaining its cohesiveness. And that, to me, as an Armenian, is a good news in a rather bad and unsettling situation.
Thank you, Dr. Harry Hagopian. Your words sound so familiar. It's as if every 20 years we need to do this somewhere. Thank you.
My pleasure, Santi.
Thank you. We hope you'll speak to us again after one of your next upcoming trips. Dr. Harry Hagopian, an attorney, representative of various church-related organizations that are active in the Middle East about the Armenian communities, and not just the Armenian communities, of Syria and Egypt in this period of uncertainty.